Now we go to our final speaker. Final speaker is Benjamin Norton, who is well known. He has also given me a very modestly short bio. Benjamin is an independent journalist and editor of the anti-imperialist news outlet Multipolarista. He lives in Latin America. Ben, please go ahead.
Thank you for having me. It's always a real pleasure being here. Everyone can hear me well, right?
Yep.
This event is framed around the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, and I think it's really important to interrogate what exactly the Monroe Doctrine is to understand the mechanisms of U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism in Latin America. And next year, 2023, is the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, which is going to be a very significant anniversary. One, because we see that as the new Cold War, the second Cold War that Washington is waging on both China and Russia, as that heats up, Latin America is becoming a major battleground. And we see more and more overt U.S. meddling, imperialist aggression in the region. But it's also important to discuss the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, because when we frame it in that context of the Monroe Doctrine dating back to 1823, we can very clearly see that the legacy of European colonialism has its direct parallel in U.S. colonialism and neocolonialism in the Americas and in the Caribbean. At the same time, when the British Empire was colonizing South Asia and large parts of Africa and Asia, as the French were colonizing North Africa and other parts of West Asia, this moment in which there were the rise of the classical European empires, the United States declared the Americas, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, to essentially be its colonial sphere of influence. And yet, the US empire, I think one of the things that's most unique about it is that, unlike empires before it, it pretends to not be an empire. The United States always claims that it is not an imperial power, that it's a democracy, that its colonies are not colonies, they are commonwealth, similar to this kind of British idea of the Commonwealth, but that they're, protectorate, countries that, supposedly aren't colonies. So Puerto Rico is a good example. I mean, it's this administrated territory. It's not actually a colony. They're clearly colonies. I mean, the United States has multiple colonies, and some of those colonies actually became states, Hawaii. The reality is that the United States has always been, at least for 200 years at least, and from its very origins, of course, in settler colonialism, it has always been an empire similar to the European-style colonial empires. And Barack Obama claimed that the United States is unique because it doesn't have, European-style empires, while ignoring blatantly, the oppression of Puerto Rico that Barack Obama personally oversaw with the passage of Promesa, which is basically a neo-colonial, unelected fiscal control board that prevents the people of Puerto Rico from exercising sovereignty over their own economic affairs. Puerto Rico's finances are controlled by this board, this unelected board of people from the United States who are not Puerto Rican, some of whom are like right-wing think tank operatives at the American Enterprise Institute. So it's really important to understand the history of the Monroe Doctrine going back 200 years to see that the United States did have this very blatant colonial history, similar to European colonial history. And while the European colonialists were expanding into Asia and Africa, and also, of course, Latin America, the United States, with the Monroe Doctrine and with its war of aggression 20 years after the Monroe Doctrine to seize and occupy the northern half of Mexico, in 1846 to 1848, those were colonialist wars of aggression that were extremely similar to the kinds of European-style colonial expansions. And it's extremely relevant. I mentioned the other key point of the new Cold War, and I want to talk about this for a second here. In the past few years, we've seen U.S. politicians become more and more explicitly neo-colonial in their rhetoric, more explicitly neo-colonial in their political actions, and more blatantly, they have been invoking this 200-year-old colonial doctrine to justify the U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela, which never ends. I mean, it still continues today. The United States is one of I think, fewer than 10 countries at this point that still continues this farce of recognizing puppet Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he never won a single vote in a presidential election, unlike the real president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, who has won millions of votes in presidential elections. So, of course, in the blatant coup attempt in Venezuela, we see this, but we also see that this in U.S. attitude in general toward the region. And starting with the Trump administration, of course, the Trump administration by no means began U.S. imperialism in Latin America. It has been consistent for hundreds of years. But there was a shift in the Trump administration in that top officials in the State Department began openly invoking the Monroe Doctrine, and repeatedly. And that includes both secretaries of state. So Rex Tillerson, who let's not forget, was an oil industry executive who came in to oversee U.S. foreign policy. And we can't ever forget the key role of the U.S. attempt to control hydrocarbons and other natural resources in the region, and being a significant motivating factor in the coup attempt against Venezuela. The control of lithium in the briefly successful coup in Bolivia, which of course was backed by the United States in November 2019. So also, we've been talking about Chile. Chile also has significant mineral reserves in addition to lithium, but copper, and that being a significant role in the infamous 1973 coup against Salvador Allende and the Anaconda Company. So anyway, this, of course, is very clear, the role of natural resources in these policies. But Rex Tillerson invoked the Monroe Doctrine, and then he was replaced by Mike Pompeo, CIA director turned Secretary of State, which, by the way, really exposes the myth that debunks the myth that the State Department and CIA are supposedly, so far apart and there's this wall separating them. No, I mean, the CIA and the State Department work very closely. And the fact that the head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, was made head of the State Department makes that very clear. Pompeo repeatedly, on multiple occasions, invoked the Monroe Doctrine. And then, of course, at the same time, Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, a neoconservative and architect of the Iraq War, someone who he was director of the Project for the New American Century, which was essentially the project for U.S. unipolar hegemony controlling the entire planet, a global dictatorship. That was the project for the New American Century. It was that the entire world is going to be the colonial property of the United States. And they tried to do that. And to an extent, there were elements that were true of this U.S. unipolar domination, although there were always honorable exceptions of nations, Cuba, the DPRK, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Eritrea, countries that always were resisting that unipolar domination. And today, of course, we see that U.S. unipolarity is completely dead. And that's why the United States is waging this new Cold War, to try to revive that unipolar order, which is never going to happen. But anyway, continuing with the thrust here of the invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, we saw that John Bolton invoked the Monroe Doctrine many times, not just in his speeches publicly, but he wrote a book, a memoir, The Room in Which It Happened. And he has an entire chapter dedicated to detailing, in a whitewashed way, of course, his role in organizing the coup attempt in Venezuela with Juan Guaido, and also many violent coup attempts that were part of that larger overall coup attempt. And in that book, he repeatedly invokes the Monroe Doctrine. And in what context are these U.S. officials invoking this 200-year-old colonial doctrine? Specifically, they're invoking it in the original context. The Monroe Doctrine was, if you go back to 1823, was the United States telling the European colonial powers, look, you have your colonial sphere of influence in the areas of the world you're colonizing. Latin America belongs to the United States. It is the U.S. colonial sphere of influence, bringing, of course, hearkening back to this arrogant, racist idea of the U.S. backyard. Although Joe Biden flipped that on its head, and Joe Biden recently said, Latin America is not the U.S. backyard, it's the U.S. front yard, as if that still somehow changes this, arrogant colonial racist attitude that the U.S. sees Latin America as its colonial property, regardless of whether or not it's the front yard or the backyard. They still see the region not as sovereign, but as its yard. So if you look at the ways in which the Monroe Doctrine is invoked by these top U.S. officials, and that has continued since the Trump administration left office, the Biden administration likewise, maybe, Anthony Blinken is a little smarter. He's a bit smarter than someone like Pompeo, he understands that it looks bad to invoke this 200-year-old doctrine, but he's basically saying the same thing without saying the words Monroe Doctrine. We've also seen Congress people in the United States, for instance, Matt Gaetz, invoke the Monroe Doctrine on the floor of the US Congress. Now, in all of these contexts in the past few years of these US officials invoking the Monroe Doctrine, 100% of the time, it was in the context of the United States saying to Latin America, you cannot have bilateral sovereign relations with China and Russia, and also Iran. That is always the context that it is invoked in. It's the same context as the US telling European colonialists, Latin America belongs to us. Of course, the difference now is that the European colonialists did not have bilateral, consensual relations with countries. They were forcibly colonizing and oppressing countries and nations across the global South. The difference now is that countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have consensual bilateral relations with China and Russia that are mutually advantageous. Chinese diplomats refer to it as the concept of win-win cooperation, mutually beneficial cooperation. The reason that China can do that is because China has a socialist government governed by a communist party, and their foreign policy is not dictated by capital, by the interests of capitalists, by what its corporations want, unlike, of course, US foreign policy, which is dictated by Wall Street. So when we look at the way that the Monroe Doctrine is invoked today, it is clearly being instrumentalized to justify further US neocolonial control over the region in the name of countering the influence of China, Russia, and Iran. And we see this directly reflected as well in the statements of US government officials, the Pentagon, insofar as their national defense strategy. The Pentagon in 2018 published a new national defense strategy that says that China and Russia are the main so-called threats to US national security. They also added Iran and the DPRK. We also see that this June, there was a NATO summit in Madrid, and NATO, the US-led imperialist alliance that's aimed at unifying the European colonialists under the leadership of the US imperialists and neocolonialists. We see that this NATO defense strategy, the strategic blueprint that they documented, they call it the strategic concept. This was the first NATO blueprint adopted in 12 years. And it says very clearly that Russia is the main threat to NATO and China is the main strategic competitor. So again, reaffirming this idea of the new Cold War, the second Cold War on China and Russia. And in that new Cold War, the United States is turning Latin America and the Caribbean into an imperialist battlefield. Now, this is not something that the region has asked for, of course. The region wants mutually beneficial relations. And as you'll listen to many leaders in the region say, of course, they deeply oppose US imperialism and its arrogant imposition of policies that they don't support, but they do want mutually beneficial consensual relations. And if the United States is willing to stop acting as this neo-colonial emperor and actually have mutually beneficial relations, these countries in the region will be willing to have those relations. We've seen that repeatedly, even from revolutionary leaders, Maduro, Ortega, Diaz-Canel. They've made it very clear they want to develop their countries. They want what's best for the peoples of their countries. But the United States, of course, is not interested in development. It's interested in de-development, in underdevelopment, and in overexploitation, because its foreign policy is not dictated by the interests of people. It's dictated by the interests of capital. So I think it's really important. I just wanted to kind of briefly do an overview there. Of course, there are historians who understand early 19th century US politics much better than I do and can go into much more detail about the historical background of the Monroe Doctrine. But I think it's really important to understand the Monroe Doctrine in the context of the classical European empires and the United States basically saying that we too have these colonial interests. We also have a very similar foreign policy, just like the colonialist foreign policy of the British Empire, of the French Empire, of the German Empire. While they were carrying out these genocidal actions in Africa and Asia, the United States was doing something very similar in Latin America. And of course, at the same time, through manifest destiny, the United States was expanding westward. At the same moment when it declares the Monroe Doctrine, it is committing genocide against native peoples to create this empire from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the fact that US politicians cognizant of that history, continue to invoke this 200-year-old colonial doctrine shows that although there might be a change in the rhetoric of the US government, the actual political and economic character of the United States as the settler colonial construct has not fundamentally shifted. I mean, of course, it's still using the over 200-year-old colonialist, racist, white supremacist, slave-supporting constitution. The United States has never had a constitutional shift, a constitutional convention to create a new constitution after more than 200 years. So, I mean, the fact that they're willing to rehabilitate this 200-year-old colonialist doctrine, the 200th anniversary is coming just next year. I think it really reflects that neo-colonialist attitude that the United States has, and how the new tactic that it's going to use to try to justify its exploitation of the region, to try to take its natural resources, to control its geostrategic access points, to prevent Nicaragua from building a canal in order to dominate the Panama Canal, in order to monopolize trade. The U.S. is going to do that in the way that the U.S. justified its colonialist interventions in Latin America in the 19th century, which is by saying that it is supposedly an anti-colonialist force. The United States started this war with the Spanish Empire in 1898 to colonize Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, saying that, no, we're not an empire, we're actually fighting the Spanish Empire. And this is supposedly a war of liberation. The United States is unique in that sense, that it has portrayed its colonialism and as imperialism as anti-colonialism. And I expect that to continue in the decades that come. The United States, the neo-colonialist power in the region, is going to portray China and Russia as the imperial powers, of course, to cover up the fact that it is itself the imperial hegemon. So thank you for inviting me.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.